All right, let's do it, guys. Okay, so this is my opinion on tanking. A lot of you guys maybe have learned of me as a tank. I've never been a tank. I've only been a DPS player tanking out of necessity in my WoW career, but that did involve me maining every single tank except for one at a top 5 world level in multiple progression raids. Every tank at one point I have mained it for that raid, and then in most raids I played all of them as an alt. Tanks haven't changed much. I will tell you straight up, I have not tanked this expansion at all, literally ever. However, I did tank on all 6 tanks frequently during beta, so I understand their new systems, and I play with some of the best tanks in the world, and I ask them a myriad of questions about these specs all the time. And because of that, when I'm making comps for raids, obviously I have decision over our tank comp, and because of that, I have to be very informed of what they're good at and why, and what they can do. Again, this is about raids. This is not about Mythic Plus at all. It's just raids. So what classes do we have? We have the Death Knight, the Blood DK, strongly misunderstood class. Then we have the Vengeance DH. We have a Brewmaster Monk. All right, down here, we have Warrior. We have Guardian Druid. We have Prop Paladin. All right. So Blood DK is weird. It has clear value at the moment. Really only... Okay, so historically, DK in a lot of expansions is really good if played properly. It's probably one of the classes in the game that's commonly considered easy, I think, but I think most tanks will tell you that this is the class that you can outplay someone else by, really greedy death strikes and just by having really good, management of your next 5 to 8 seconds rather than living in the moment. It's just there's a very... I don't even know if there's a low skill floor on DK. I actually am kind of baffled as to why people think it's easy. I think the casual Blood DK is easy argument is probably somewhere along the lines of, oh, you just hit Death Strike, bro. It's fine. But most DKs that aren't very great, get one shot a lot. I think one of the best examples of that would have been Orgazoa from Eternal Palace. It was a boss that hit you really hard at the beginning, and then it got less hard over time the more stacks you had. And I remember even popular content creators saying how Blood DK was so mediocre for that fight. And I thought Blood DK was maybe the single best defensive tank for that fight in a 2-tank scenario, which is we only ever 2-tanked it. We never 3-tanked it. But you just had to CD early, and then that class over every other class would just never require healing. Yeah, it's maybe a little safer. You get hit less hard on other classes, but you're healing all of the damage back. It's always really hard to determine DK's value because you can't see it up front in, how the hits you take appear big, but obviously it's just a class where it's really weird that your active mitigation and your throughput is just your runic power bar and your ability to generate runic power, and basically nothing else. It's really hard to heal DKs. To heal a DK, you kind of need to understand the runic power. If you're newer to the game as a healer or don't understand tanking, you can see them dipping from 100 to 10% over and over again, and they're actually perfectly safe, and you may be spamming them, when in reality, they can be at 100% tanking 3 mobs, have no runic power, and they could die in 3 seconds, right? So it's about knowing when they're actually in danger. The clear value or niche is AMZ, and the ability to live for long periods of time without healing. However, right now, that's not quite where they are. I will tell you, when DK is going to potentially jump in the tank meta to just be extremely, extremely strong, and I'll already tell you that right now they're easily a top 3 defensive tank in the raid. We'll get into some of the other ones in a second. They're definitely in that upper echelon of tankiness. It's just the way that they're tanky is different. And going into next raid, I think they might be the single tankiest tank. And if Unholy DKs or Frost DKs ever fall out of favor, it's going to be a very popular raid pick. Even though their damage is a little lacking, it's going to be a very popular raid pick for their raid cooldown, which is just insanely good. And also, they, more than any other tank, besides maybe Paladin, I think Paladin with 2 legendaries is going to really pop off in the damage department. Blood DK in the defensive department, when you have the runic power gain from Super Strain and from Brynadors in a couple patches, that's going to be insane. Giving blood DKs more runic power is a very dangerous combination. That's when you start approaching the area of not needing any healing, which is pretty broken. It's rarely happened in WoW. The only true DKs needed no healing. Like it's always like pretty much the same, because like you never actually don't heal a DK in raids, right? Like you usually get close to it, but they're already getting passive healing. They're getting, they have like rejuve on them if you have a Rest or Druid. Like it's a common thing for healers to just naturally, if they're just conserving mana, to just be healing waving the tank so nothing's happening. But they never need to be spammed or anything like that. They're usually extremely self-sufficient. It's also the most fun tank to play, almost objectively. Obviously, there's a lot of opinions there, but of the top tanks in the world, myself, who was just in tanked for limit at a world top 2, world top 5 level for the past 4 years on every single spec, will tell you Blood DK is my favorite tank to play when it's meta. Now, Echo's tank, DK is his favorite. Mirez, Echo's other tank, DK is his favorite. Scott, the Limit's tank, DK is his favorite to play in progression. And Darky, Limit's other tank, is DK is his favorite tank in progression. That's not a coincidence. It's because the class is just, you are the most in control of your survival. You have the most agency over your character on a DK than you do any other tank at the moment, and that is something that the best players like. It's why, I mean, this is a whole different discussion, but that's why everyone liked the game a lot more MoP and WoD for tanking, because all the tanks relative to now just had so much more control over their survival. It's still the case where you're in control, and just to be completely clear and blunt, if you die as a tank, it's your fault 99% of the time. You could have always done something better. Better management of externals, better management of yourself. If you guys raid with a player that constantly looks at his death log when he dies, dude's real bad. And or not constantly looks at his death logs, but looks at his death logs and quickly tries to move the blame onto someone else for any reason, dude's definitely dog shit. But that's fine. So that's mainly the thing with DK. You just have a ton of agency over your character. AMZ's insane. I think when 2 legendaries happens, they're going to pop off. Now, you guys in chat are like, wait, what? 2 legendaries? They haven't announced 2 legendaries. It's not going to happen in 9.1, but I can tell you right now, I'd bet everything that a very natural patch progression system will involve you having the ability to equip 2 legendaries on every class in the game. They did it in Legion. It's a very natural thing to expect from Blizzard. There will be some other systems, but that is just the easiest slam dunk, everyone will love it thing of all time. So that's almost certainly going to happen. Now, keep in mind, when we were talking about DPS meta, it's kind of hard to tell, because certainly by the very late time in this expansion where they actually allow that, it's also going to be, there's going to be more legendaries added to the game. But I would tell you right now, just without anything else in a raid scenario, Blood DK, in my opinion, with 2 legendaries will surpass every other one of these tanks in defensiveness, and I already think they're top 3. Another member of top 3 defensiveness at the moment, next up on the list, is Vengeance Demon Hunter. Now, kind of true with DK as well as a lot of these other classes, more so Brewmaster and Warrior. Their viability in a lot of ways is also heavily dependent on the viability of their mirrored melee spec. Like, Vengeance DH was run in Nathria. It's a top 3 tankiness spec. It does pretty good damage. The only thing that does a lot more single target is like Paladin, and Brewmaster does a bit more. But it has the best AoE damage in like most raid scenarios. And it's very tanky. It's way more tanky than Paladin, and definitely more tanky than Brewmaster. And also, I mean, when we were making our decisions for raid comps this raid, Havoc just wasn't in a spot we wanted. And Vengeance could have been much less as good as it is. And we would have still ran it, because we needed a magic buff, and Havoc just clearly wasn't good enough. And again, most of this is about world first rating, because like I think that tanks should always just play whatever they're best at, because they're all viable. But this is just for the very optimal stuff. A lot of the times your tank comp has to do with how viable the DPS specs are, because you have to bring raid buffs. Like, for example, in this raid, for the top 3 guilds, both tanks were raid buffs. So now, some were picked for other reasons, but Vengeance was picked for that. This isn't about Mythic Plus. In fact, Mythic Plus has nothing to do with this list. It's just kind of talking about their overall strengths and weaknesses. But they are the clear top Mythic Plus tank right now, so that obviously has some value. They don't have Darkness, however, they can get it by running a legendary. I don't think it'll ever see much time used because their actual legendary is pretty good. But you can run a legendary as Vengeance where if you go below a certain health threshold, you drop a darkness. And this can be really useful played around its ICD in a raid. You know, if you know every 2 minutes or 3 minutes, whenever the ICD is, that your raid is going to dip and you're going to dip at a certain spot, and you can equip a legendary that basically gives you a raid cooldown. For a raid, that is probably the best legendary. Although it's very specific where you would use it, and you'd have to play around it, right? So Brewmaster. Brewmaster's in a weird spot. And it's kind of the same with Warrior, where I don't really know where to put either of these. They're obviously depending on tuning, but right now, with Windwalker being good, they depend on tuning, because they don't really do anything. They bring a raid buff, but these classes bring like other stuff than raid buffs. Well, kind of. Like this one can bring a raid CD. It's just like kind of weird. This one does bring a raid CD. Brewmaster honestly is kind of strong depending on tuning. It's been run double Brewmaster for a lot of last expansion because they were strong. Well, in a lot of cases, they weren't actually as strong as people thought. It was just they were perceived to be stronger than they were. But I mean, Monk has always been good. It's been like it also has a pretty high skill ceiling too. Like I think people think Monk is an easier class, but then like you watch last expansion and then how people handled purifying and doing damage on a Monk last expansion, there was just massive gaps between players on that class, because I think it's commonly referred to as this thing you just stick tanks on and they don't die as much, but they require so much extra healing that it's not as good. They do really good single target right now, and I think decent AoE. But like AoE in tanks in a raid, AoE is not like the biggest thing. The only thing that's like really noticeable from tanks for AoEing in raid is like probably Guardians thrashing within Karn with the legendary, and probably the Kyrian Sigil from Vengeance where they really spike. Like Brewmaster has decent overall, but it's not like spiky enough to like actually matter for like a AoE scenario. I also think it's one of the 3 weaker classes at the moment. So this is weird. I think they do have value. They do have value, but they are tuning based. Like, but it also depends on Windwalker. It's just so weird. Like it having clear value would be that it's a Monk buff, and Windwalker and Mistweaver are usually not great. Where Windwalker right now is insanely good. Like Brewmaster was not the correct pick this tier because Windwalker was so strong. And it was clearly weaker than Vengeance. So I'm not sure. You could honestly leave this anywhere in between these two things. I think it having the raid buff means it does have clear value, but it doesn't really have a niche in tanking. It's not the strongest physical damage tank like it had been at some points in the past, depending on when you've taunted. Especially last expansion, Warrior was the best against physical damage in raids, and it had more coverage because of shield block uptime, where Monks were superior to Warriors only in a scenario where you were tanking for about 25 or 30 seconds or less, and you could go through all of your purifies. And also, I think Brewmaster will scale pretty well as well. So we're gonna leave it up here, but just know it definitely has some weaknesses right now. It is not nearly the powerhouse that it was perceived to be over the past couple expansions. I think it's very possible going into a new raid that... Actually, I think it's very possible right now that Brewmaster doesn't see raid play in an optimal scenario for a couple of raids, actually. And a big part of that is how good Windwalker is. Not just how well it's tuned, but just how well Windwalker fits in a raid right now and all of the certain roles it covers. And then after that's Prot Warrior. Again, Prot Warrior is such a ruined designed class from what it used to be. I think when you play a Prot Warrior, you have to like get yourself out of the mindset that this is this great class from last expansion that was, you know, that everyone played and really liked. You know, it had like I think anger management's one of like the coolest systems in the game where you can spend your resource and just knock every cooldown you have down, but then they nerfed it to only be a few abilities. The fact that Last Stand gave you shield block on a free row. The only class, in my opinion, that has ever been ruined more than what current Prot Warrior is playstyle-wise compared to what it was recently is Feral Druid and Mist of Pandaria, and then what they've done to it now since then. Feral Druid used to be all about your dots, right? Like really, really high IQ, like low combo point rips on stuff that weren't going to live very long with like Rune Up and stuff like that. And then they turn it into that with... Now it's just like a weird, like, get to 5 combo points, and Ferocious Bite is basically just like Eviscerate, and they basically took all the intricacy out of the spec, and it just like spams a 5 points really hard hitting finisher like every other melee spec does. So small feral rant, but that's what Prot Warrior, the only thing that's been ruined more than current Prot Warrior is that. And they do have value because they have a raid buff, they have spell reflect, they have intervene. They also have like decent execute damage when they're not tanking, but that's not too great. They're going to have the most value in the world in 9.0.5 because Necrolord just became insanely good for tanks. Probably, unless you need movement, which this class doesn't, it's probably going to be the strongest signature ability of any Covenant. And they just gave themselves the ability to buff DPS. They will probably nerf it, but currently at 400 mastery, on people's very strong 2 minutes, if you play it right, should be the most single target DPS in a raid environment from a warrior. Although they'll have to run, well, again, sims are bad, but they'll have to look at that. But that's going to be extremely strong, and if it's not top overall single target, it will certainly be top when you have to pop your cooldowns and do a ton of damage in mythic progression, and certain stuff has more importance than a basic 5-minute sim. Next is Druid. Druid is entirely dependent on tuning, but right now it's tuned really good. I don't know if you guys have played a Guardian Druid in Raid, but they're fucking unkillable. They're like, I actually might go as far as say that they might be the strongest tank right now. The Blood DK, Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Guardian are definitely in a top 3. Like, if you're playing them properly, these classes are just so fucking tanky in a raid. But Guardian is just like, it is very strong. They don't do a lot of damage. However, they do really good burst AoE, especially with specific covenants and legendaries. And it's sustained over a longer period of time. Very strong. But yeah, their defensiveness, for example, if they were a weaker defensive tank right now, keep in mind they might be the strongest defensive tank at the moment, and they still weren't brought to World First Progress. And that's because you don't need Roar. Moonkins are among the best classes in the game. They're going to have Roar in your raid group. You don't need a Roar from a tank. They need a good way for Blizzard to buff Bear. I've always said this. Is one, they need the old Roar they used to have. They like nerfed Mark Reversal and like Roar at the end of that expansion at the same time. Dude, let Druids have a 60-yard Roar again on a shorter cooldown. That would actually give them something that's worthwhile. That would be better than a Moonkins Roar, because sometimes you're spread out. But they need something else. This class has a raid buff and insane self-sustainability. This class has, historically as well, not just right now. This class, Vengeance is like a mixture between Prot Warrior and Blood DK, where Demon Spikes is kind of similar to Shield Block with less potency, but then the back half of Vengeance DH is they have the same heal yourself for the amount of damage you've taken over 5 seconds like a Death Knight. It's like a mix of the two classes with a bunch of interesting utility you can use in a pack of mobs, right? Like, Brewmaster has a raid buff. Historically, the stagger mechanic has broken a lot of mechanics in the game and is usually good in some stuff. Also, magic stagger is really good for some fights like Hungering Destroyer, where, you know, on 100 to 0 on Hungering Destroyer, if you have 2 Brewmaster Monks versus like 2 of a lot of other specs, just magic stagger alone will take 1% of the health off that boss because it won't leech from you as much. You know, Warriors always had a raid cooldown, a raid buff, and they've been typically the strongest physical damage tanks when they have shield block up. Again, their shield block uptime was nerfed, so on a lot of fights it's not as good. But like, that's their value. Druids have never been the #1 of anything. In my opinion, and they've kind of went through this with Heart of the Wild, because Guardian Druid Heart of the Wild is the strongest Heart of the Wild there is of any of those specs for healing. And, well, it might be for all of them, but I know it is for healing. Is to let them lean into the Druid shapeshifty thing. Druids, if they are shifting into Cat or Moonkin form when they're not tanking, should be the strongest tank DPS, without question. It's already so much of that class is like, in quotes, fantasy, where, you know, they like transform into other forms to do damage, and it actually is good. Right now, it's not. They need to be the highest single target class when they are not tanking. It has to be there. That can be a huge niche. If you're like, all right, we need a little bit more damage in the raid, in a world first meta scenario, you're like, okay, well, maybe we can bring Guardian, because like we can have this other guy tank for a minute, and then the Guardian can just like pop Heart of the Wild and just like fucking rip damage, right? Like, right now it's good on logs, but like I want it to be even better, because like even with it being good on logs right now, I find it really hard to believe that it would actually be ran in progression, because typically speaking, the top guilds tanks are so good that they're going to live on any class, and they're just only going to go for the offensive / utility benefits of them. I want this class to like absolutely annihilate shit. Although they have kind of moved pretty good in that direction, but just something like that. And the last is Paladin. So Paladin is maybe has the most value or niche. And if you're a Paladin player, I get your complaining. Your class has been unbelievably not tanky for almost 3 years now. It's been noticeably squishier than every tank in the game, or in raid content specifically. But, and I don't know if Blizzard designs the game this way, if Paladin was a top 3 tankiness spec in the game, it would be double prop Paladin in every raid. They do really good damage. Their legendaries, especially when you get 2 of them, will be insanely good for prot. Ashen Hollow is awesome in a raid. And they have multiple, they have an immunity themselves. They have the ability to give immunities to everyone else. They're the only tank with a true immunity. It's not the biggest deal, but like on a boss like Denathrius, where yes, you'll get hit harder, 3 times in P2 you can spell ward or bubble your debuff off from tanking the boss, making it much easier, right? So it's different the way you do bosses as Paladin, but their movement really suffers unless you have like Dwarf Shadows or something, obviously, to like actually get somewhere on really movement intense bosses. Denathrius is one of the hardest movement intense bosses that there's been in a while, where I think in progression they would have struggled there. But man, their toolkit is just incredible. Their off healing is incredible. The damage they do is incredible. They have an external immunity and their own immunity. I mean, they just have everything to them. And it is crazy that they are usually so low tuned that they're still not brought to progression, because if they were even remotely defensively viable to kill a boss 10 to 15 eye levels lower than most of you guys kill bosses, they would be run just constantly. And I think they were pretty close to being run this raid. We would have ran one right before they nerfed their damage the very last time. When they nerfed it the very last time, we were like, all right, that's too much of a nerf to not run it. But I mean, honestly, if like I said, if you're a prop Paladin player, I understand being frustrated, because you're saying like, oh, well, like, yeah, I get that we have all this utility, and if we were tanky, it would be too strong. But Blizzard doesn't design the game like that. And you're right. Like, look at the healer discussion, right? Holy Paladins, Disc Priests, and Resto Shamans consistently have more utility that gets them into raids without even looking at tuning than Resto Druids and Mistweavers. So using that same argument, you should say that Resto Druids and Mistweavers should always do more throughput than those other classes. And you're right. Good game design would have you have them always do more healing than them, because they're worthless without it. It's the same thing. But Blizzard just simply doesn't design the game that way. They don't give classes more throughput, damage or healing wise or tanking wise, defensiveness, because they have so much utility. They've never designed the game that way, for better or worse. So something kind of needs to be done with Paladin. Like, I don't know, if I was a Paladin player, I'd be like, hey man, I'm okay with you nerfing my utility a little bit and just make me like 20% tankier at all times in a raid, But then again, it's hard because of like PvP, right? Like, they probably have to make changes constantly to prop Paladin because of its meminess in PvP at the moment. It's also historically been decent in Mythic Plus. It's probably, over the past like 2 expansions, been like a top 3 Mythic Plus class, I'd say, right? Like, it always gets some play in high keys, even though it has like really, really hard problems with tanking huge pulls at the beginning. What Cashzilla said, how do you put a number on utility and translate it? Look, I'm an idiot. I have no idea how to design a game. All I'm saying is, I don't know how you put a number on utility, but the way that we've put this, you definitely need to you need to have some kind of accounting for utility. Like, do you guys think it makes sense for melee to be the way they were this raid? Unholy DK did like more single target, or as much single target as any melee, right? They had more execute than every melee class with Soul Reaper. Even more than Arms Warriors. Maybe that's not true after the most recent Unholy nerf, but that was true before that. And then on top of all of that, Rogues have nothing, and a couple other classes have nothing, and Unholy has like basically Cloak on a shorter cooldown and AMZ. So if Unholy has all of these advantages, they have the most damage and they have AMZ, how could you ever bring another class? And then that's what you saw in progression, right? The melee comp in progression was some guilds brought a warrior. Every guild, after they saw that it was good, brought a Windwalker. And then you brought 4 of these things. You could have brought 1 Unholy DK and 1 Rogue and 1 Enhancement Shaman. All these classes were good. 1 Rep Paladin. But why would you do that when you could just run 4 of these? And you have 4 AMZs now. There has to be a number on utility. I don't know what it is, but it's not fair. like like a class should never have the best execute in the game. Have 10% more health than every class in the game. Have Cloak of Shadows on a 1-minute cooldown. Have the most burst on the pull. And then also have a raid cooldown. That doesn't make sense. Right?